Hello everyone. My name is Damian Rodriguez, and I am a park ranger stationed in the remote wilderness areas of the Pacific Northwest. Today I'm going to share with you the most terrifying experience of my entire career, something that still keeps me awake at night, and honestly, I'm not even sure I should be telling you this. What I witnessed out there in those woods, it defies every logical explanation, and it made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. This isn't just another camping story or wildlife encounter. This is something far more sinister, something that the National Park Service doesn't want the public to know about. Before I begin, I can see that 80% of my viewers haven't subscribed while watching my videos, so please hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, and ring that notification bell. Also, please comment below and let me know where you're watching from, what time it is where you are. And if you have your own paranormal or unexplained story, feel free to email us or drop it in the comments. I love hearing from you all. Now, let me take you back to September of last year. I had been working as a park ranger for almost 15 years, at that point, stationed primarily in the vast wilderness areas that stretch across the remote regions of the Cascade Mountains. These are places where cell phone service doesn't exist, where you can hike for days without seeing another human soul, and where nature still reigns supreme in all its untamed glory. I thought I had seen everything the wilderness could throw at me: bears, mountain lions, dangerous weather conditions, lost hikers, medical emergencies, but nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what I encountered during what was supposed to be a routine patrol. It started on a Tuesday morning in late September. The weather was crisp and clear, perfect conditions for what should have been a standard 3-day solo patrol of the northern sector. This particular area encompasses roughly 40 square miles of dense forest, steep ravines, and scattered meadows. It's considered one of the most remote and pristine sections of the park, and typically, I only venture out there maybe once every few months to check on trail conditions and ensure no illegal camping or hunting activities are taking place. I remember packing my gear that morning: standard equipment, GPS device, radio though it rarely worked in that terrain, first aid supplies, enough food and water for 4 days just to be safe, and my service weapon, which I had only drawn twice in my entire career, both times for aggressive wildlife encounters. Little did I know, that weapon would prove utterly useless against what I was about to face. The drive to the trailhead took about 2 hours along increasingly rough dirt roads. By the time I reached the parking area, which was really just a small clearing carved out of the forest, it was nearly 10 in the morning. The plan was straightforward: hike approximately 12 miles to a designated camping spot near Crystal Lake, spend the night, then continue the patrol circuit the following day before heading back. But as I stepped out of my vehicle, I noticed something that should have been a warning sign. The air was completely still, not even the slightest breeze, and there was an odd quality to the light, as if the sun was shining through some kind of filter. The temperature felt wrong too, colder than it should have been for that time of year and time of day. The first few hours of hiking were completely normal. The trail was in decent condition despite some recent storm damage. I encountered the usual wildlife: a few deer, some squirrels. Heard what sounded like an elk calling in the distance. The forest was alive with the sounds you'd expect: birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, the occasional crack of a branch. But looking back now, I realized that even these normal sounds had a strained quality, as if the animals were forcing themselves to maintain their usual patterns despite sensing something wrong. As I got deeper into the wilderness, maybe 6 or 7 miles from the trailhead, I started to notice something odd. The forest was becoming increasingly quiet. At first I didn't think much of it. Sometimes animals go silent when they sense a predator nearby, or when weather changes are coming. But this silence was different. It was profound, almost unnatural. It was the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, that makes you aware of the sound of your own blood flowing through your veins. Even the wind seemed to have died down to nothing. My footsteps on the trail sounded unnaturally loud, echoing off the trees in a way that made me feel exposed, vulnerable. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, though I couldn't explain why. Something primal in my brain was sending warning signals, the same instincts that kept our ancestors alive in dangerous situations, were firing on all cylinders. Around 3 in the afternoon, I decided to take a break at a small clearing where I had a good view of the surrounding ridgelines. I pulled out my radio and tried to make contact with the ranger station, but as expected, got nothing but static. The GPS was working fine, showing me exactly where I was on the trail, but something about the whole situation was starting to feel off. That's when I heard it for the first time, a sound that I still can't adequately describe. It was like a low rumbling, almost like distant thunder, but it seemed to be coming from the ground itself. The vibration traveled up through my boots, through my legs, and settled in my chest like a physical weight. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped abruptly, leaving the forest in that same unnatural silence. I stood there for several minutes, listening intently, trying to determine if I had imagined it or if there was some logical explanation. Maybe heavy machinery operating somewhere nearby, though that seemed unlikely given our remote location. Maybe some kind of geological activity, though the area wasn't known for seismic events. But deep down, I knew that whatever had caused that rumbling was neither mechanical nor geological. Eventually, I convinced myself it was probably just my imagination, or maybe some distant aircraft that I couldn't see. I packed up my gear and continued hiking, but I found myself moving faster than usual, eager to reach my designated camping spot before dark. The shadows between the trees seemed darker than they should have been, and I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, movement that disappeared the moment I turned to look directly at it. The trail began descending into a narrow valley, and the trees grew thicker, blocking out much of the afternoon sunlight. The temperature seemed to drop noticeably, and I found myself pulling on an extra layer, even though I had been comfortable just moments before. My breath was starting to fog slightly in the cold air, which was completely wrong for September in that region. It was in this valley that I made my first truly disturbing discovery. About 50 yards off the main trail, I noticed what appeared to be trees that had been systematically stripped of their bark. Not just 1 or 2 trees, but dozens of them, arranged in what almost looked like a deliberate pattern. The bark hadn't been removed by animals, the edges were too clean, too precise, and the wood underneath had an odd, almost burned appearance, as if it had been seared by intense heat. I approached cautiously to get a better look, and that's when I noticed the smell. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered, sweet and cloying, but with an underlying scent of decay that made my stomach turn. The smell seemed to be strongest near the stripped trees, but I couldn't identify any obvious source. It was as if the scent was emanating from the trees themselves, or from something buried beneath them. My training kicked in at that point, and I began documenting what I was seeing, taking photographs, making notes about the location, the condition of the trees, anything that might help explain this unusual phenomenon. But even as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was observing me from the dense forest surrounding this strange clearing. The sensation was so strong that I actually called out, asking if anyone was there, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive silence. I spent maybe 20 minutes investigating the area, but the smell was becoming overwhelming, and the feeling of being watched was growing stronger by the minute. At one point, I could have sworn I saw a large shadow moving between the stripped trees, but when I turned my flashlight in that direction, there was nothing there, just more of those unnaturally bare trunks standing like sentinels in the gathering dusk. I decided to return to the main trail and continue toward my camping destination, planning to report the unusual tree damage when I returned to the ranger station. But as I walked back toward the trail, I heard that rumbling sound again, louder this time, and definitely coming from somewhere beneath my feet. The ground actually seemed to vibrate slightly, and I could feel the vibration through my hiking boots, traveling up my spine like an electric shock. The rumbling continued for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 30 or 40 seconds. During those terrifying moments, I could swear I heard something else mixed in with the sound, something that sounded almost like voices, deep, resonant voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. Then gradually, the rumbling faded away, leaving behind that same oppressive silence. I realized that my heart was pounding, and my hands were actually trembling slightly. Fear was beginning to replace curiosity. I made it back to the main trail without incident, but I found myself constantly looking back over my shoulder, expecting to see what I didn't know. The rational part of my brain kept telling me there had to be a logical explanation for what I was experiencing, but my instincts were screaming at me that something was very wrong in this place. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound, or lack of sound, sent chills down my spine. The trail continued descending toward Crystal Lake, and as the afternoon wore on, I began to notice other disturbing signs. Several more areas where trees had been stripped in that same methodical way. Animal tracks that I couldn't identify. Despite my years of experience, the tracks were huge, easily 3 times the size of any bear print I had ever seen, and they had an unusual shape, almost hand-like, with what appeared to be opposable thumbs. At one point, I discovered what appeared to be a large section of forest floor that had been completely cleared of vegetation, as if something massive had been dragged across the ground. The cleared area was roughly circular, maybe 30 feet in diameter, and the earth had a strange, almost glassy appearance, as if it had been subjected to intense heat. In the center of this circle, I found what looked like symbols, carved deep into the hardened earth. Symbols that definitely weren't made by any animal. But perhaps most unsettling of all was the continued absence of wildlife. In 15 years of patrolling these forests, I had never experienced such complete silence. No birds, no insects, no small mammals rustling in the underbrush. It was as if every living creature in this entire valley had simply vanished or had been driven away by something so terrifying that they couldn't risk remaining in the area. Hey everyone, I hope you're finding this story as chilling as I found living through it. If you're enjoying this content, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these important stories, and trust me, what I'm about to tell you next will make what you've already heard seem like a pleasant walk in the park. By the time I reached Crystal Lake around 6 in the evening, my nerves were completely on edge. The lake itself, which I had visited many times over the years, looked somehow different. The water, which was normally a crystal clear blue, had a dark, almost oily appearance, and there was a strange shimmering quality to the surface, as if something was moving just beneath. Floating near the shore were what appeared to be dozens of dead fish, their silver bodies catching the last rays of sunlight. But as I got closer, I realized these weren't ordinary fish. They were species I had never seen before, with elongated bodies and fins that looked almost wing-like. Their eyes, even in death, had a milky white appearance that was deeply unsettling. I had planned to camp near the lake, but something about the scene made me profoundly uncomfortable. The smell from earlier seemed stronger here, mixing with the scent of dead fish to create an odor that made me gag. And there were more of those stripped trees visible around the lake's perimeter, arranged in what was clearly a deliberate pattern, forming what looked almost like some kind of primitive amphitheater. As I stood there at the water's edge, trying to decide what to do, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, the same massive, hand-like tracks I had seen earlier, leading from the forest, down to the water's edge, and then, impossibly, continuing out onto the surface of the lake, as if whatever had made them was able to walk on water. I decided to continue hiking and find a different camping spot, somewhere that felt less contaminated. But as I turned to leave, I heard a splash behind me. I spun around, expecting to see a fish jumping or maybe a beaver, but the lake surface was perfectly still, except for ripples spreading outward from a point maybe 20 feet from shore, ripples that were far too large to have been made by any fish. About a mile past the lake, I found a small clearing that seemed relatively normal. The trees were intact, the ground was clear, and while the silence persisted, at least I couldn't smell that sickening sweet odor. I quickly set up my tent, started a small fire, and prepared a simple dinner, all while daylight remained. I wanted to have everything ready before full darkness fell, because something told me that nightfall would bring new horrors. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped significantly, and I found myself adding layers of clothing and feeding the fire more frequently than usual. But it wasn't just the physical cold that was bothering me. There was something about this place, this entire valley, that felt fundamentally wrong, hostile even. The darkness seemed thicker here, more oppressive, as if it was a living thing that was actively pressing in on my small circle of firelight. I tried to radio the ranger station again, but got nothing except static. I checked my GPS to confirm my location and ensure that my route back was clearly marked. Everything seemed to be functioning normally from a technical standpoint, but I was beginning to seriously consider cutting the patrol short and heading back first thing in the morning. Every instinct I had was telling me to get out of this place, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was lurking in these woods. Around 9 o'clock, as I sat by the fire trying to read a book to take my mind off the day's strange experiences, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a sound like nothing I had ever heard before. A series of long, mournful calls that seemed to echo through the entire valley. The calls were definitely not from any animal I was familiar with. They were too structured, too deliberate, almost like some kind of communication, or maybe a ritual chant. The calls seemed to be coming from multiple directions, as if several creatures were calling back and forth to each other across the valley. And with each exchange, the calls seemed to be getting closer, moving in toward my location. I sat perfectly still, listening as the calls continued for several minutes, trying to determine how many different voices I was hearing, and more importantly, where they were coming from. The sound was unlike anything I had encountered in 15 years of wilderness patrol. It was haunting, primal, and filled me with a deep sense of dread that I couldn't shake. There was something almost human about the vocalizations, but wrong, as if they were coming from throats that weren't quite designed for speech. The calls had a wet, gurgling quality that made my skin crawl. I reached for my flashlight and swept it across the tree lane surrounding my campsite, but the beam only penetrated maybe 20 feet into the dense forest before being swallowed by the darkness. The calls continued for what felt like hours, though when I checked my watch it had only been about 10 minutes. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped, leaving behind a silence that was somehow even more terrifying than the sounds had been. The silence that followed was even more oppressive than before. I could hear my own breathing, my own heartbeat, the crackling of the fire, but nothing else. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I had the distinct impression that whatever had been making those calls was now moving through the woods in complete silence, getting closer, studying me, deciding what to do with the intruder in their domain. I decided to stay awake that night, keeping the fire burning and my back to a large boulder that provided some protection. Every few minutes I would shine my flashlight into the surrounding woods, but I never saw anything, just trees and shadows and darkness that seemed to move and shift in ways that defied logic. The shadows seemed to have a life of their own, reaching toward my campfire with fingers of darkness that retreated whenever my light touched them. Around midnight, I heard the rumbling again, but this time it was much closer, much stronger. The ground beneath my sleeping bag actually shook, and I could hear what sounded like trees creaking and groaning under some immense pressure. Whatever was causing the vibrations was massive, and it was moving slowly, methodically, circling my campsite just beyond the reach of my firelight. I grabbed my radio and desperately tried to make contact with anyone, but there was nothing but static. The rumbling continued for nearly a minute this time, and during those terrifying seconds, I could swear I heard something else mixed in with the sound, voices, definitely voices, speaking in that same unknown language I had heard earlier, but closer now, much closer, as if the speakers were standing just outside my ring of firelight. When the rumbling finally stopped, I noticed that my campfire had nearly gone out. The flames had dwindled to barely glowing embers, even though I had been feeding it regularly throughout the evening. I quickly added more wood and managed to get it blazing again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been draining the energy from the fire, from the entire area, as if my light was somehow offensive to whatever was lurking in the darkness. For the next several hours, I experienced what I can only describe as psychological warfare. Every time I would start to relax, even slightly, something would happen to remind me that I was being watched. A branch would snap in the distance, just loud enough for me to hear. A rock would roll down a slope somewhere in the darkness, landing with a thud that seemed impossibly loud in the oppressive silence. At one point, I could swear I heard breathing, slow, deep, rhythmic, coming from multiple directions at once. The worst part was the feeling of intelligence behind these sounds. They weren't random, they were deliberate, calculated, designed to keep me on edge, to wear down my mental defenses. Whatever was out there was playing with me, like a cat toying with a mouse, testing my reactions, learning about me, preparing for something. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a new sound, footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, circling my campsite, just beyond the reach of my firelight. The steps had an odd rhythm, not quite human, but not animal either. They would take 3 steps, pause, take 3 more steps, pause, as if whatever was making them was being very careful about where it placed its feet. I grabbed my flashlight and tried to follow the sound, sweeping the beam in the direction of the footsteps, but I could never quite catch up. The light would illuminate empty forest, but I could still hear the steps, just ahead of where I was looking, always just out of sight. The footsteps continued for what felt like an eternity, slowly, methodically, making a complete circuit of my campsite. Then another, then another. The rest of that night passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. I would drift off for a few minutes, then jolt awake at some perceived sound or movement. My dreams, when I managed to have them, were filled with shadowy figures moving through the trees, calling to each other in that alien language, planning something terrible. By the time dawn finally broke, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. My nerves were completely shot, and I had made the decision to cut the patrol short and head back to civilization as quickly as possible. But as I began breaking down my camp in the early morning light, I made a discovery that changed everything. There, pressed deep into the soft earth around my campsite, were footprints. But these weren't human footprints, or animal prints, or anything I had ever seen before. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own boot prints, and they had that same strange, almost hand-like shape I had seen near the lake. The prints formed a complete circle around my campsite. Not just one circle, but 3 distinct circles, each one closer to my tent than the last, as if something had been slowly, methodically walking around my camp all night while I huddled by the fire. The innermost circle came within 10 feet of where I had been sleeping, close enough that whatever made them could have reached out and touched my tent if it had wanted to. I counted the prints carefully, taking photographs from multiple angles, documenting their size, their depth, their unusual characteristics. There were at least 90 individual prints, perfectly spaced, all facing toward the center where I had been sleeping. The depth of the impressions suggested that whatever made them was incredibly heavy, much heavier than any known animal in the region. But what disturbed me most was what I found in the center of the innermost circle, that pressed into the earth just a few feet from where my head had been while I slept, was a message, not written in any human language, but carved deep into the ground with what must have been massive claws. The symbols were intricate, deliberate, clearly meaningful, though I had no idea what they meant. Looking at them filled me with a dread so profound that I had to look away. My hands were shaking as I took photographs of everything. The tracks, the symbols, the entire scene. But even as I worked, I could feel that presence again, that sensation of being watched, being studied. Whatever had circled my camp all night was still out there, still observing, still deciding what to do with me. I packed my gear with unprecedented speed, stuffing everything into my backpack, without my usual careful organization. All I wanted was to get out of that valley, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever had been stalking me through the night. The morning air was crisp and clear, but that sickening sweet smell seemed stronger than ever, clinging to everything like some kind of invisible fog. As I started back up the trail toward the main hiking route, I noticed more of those strange strip trees. They seemed to be everywhere now, arranged in patterns that definitely weren't random. Some formed straight lines that disappeared into the forest. Others created geometric shapes that made no sense from a natural perspective. It was as if something intelligent was marking territory, or perhaps creating some kind of navigation system. Or maybe, and this thought chilled me to the bone, they were markers of some kind, warnings or promises. The climb out of the valley was steep and challenging under normal circumstances. But with my nerves shot and my pack hastily organized, it was absolutely exhausting. I had to stop every few hundred yards to catch my breath and check my GPS, making sure I was still on the correct route back to the trailhead. But every time I stopped, I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I was making myself an easy target for whatever was following me. Because something was following me. I was sure of it. I could hear movement in the forest behind me, keeping pace with my progress, but staying just out of sight. Branches would snap, leaves would rustle, rocks would tumble down slopes, always just far enough away that I couldn't see what was causing the sounds, but close enough to let me know that I wasn't alone. It was during one of these rest stops, maybe 3 miles from my campsite, that I had the encounter that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I had just sat down on a fallen log to drink some water when I heard movement in the thick forest to my left. Something large was moving through the underbrush, breaking branches, displacing rocks, heading directly toward my location. The sounds were getting louder, closer. Whatever was making them was big, and it wasn't trying to be stealthy anymore. My first instinct was that it might be a bear, and I quickly stood up and made myself look as large as possible while speaking in a calm, firm voice, the standard protocol for bear encounters. But what emerged from the tree-lane was not a bear. It was not any animal I had ever seen or read about in my extensive training. It was something that belonged in nightmares, not in the waking world. The creature stood upright, easily 8 feet tall, covered in what appeared to be dark, matted fur or hair that seemed to move and writhe even when there was no wind. Its limbs were disproportionately long and thin, and its movements were disturbingly fluid, almost hypnotic, like it was floating rather than walking. The proportions were all wrong. The arms too long, the torso too narrow, the legs bent at angles that shouldn't have been possible. But it was the face that nearly made me collapse with terror. It was almost human-like, but wrong in every conceivable way. The features were stretched and distorted, as if someone had taken a human face and pulled it like taffy. The eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire visible surface, like looking into deep wells of darkness. And when it opened its mouth, I could see rows of teeth that belonged to no creature on this planet, sharp, pointed, arranged in multiple rows like a shark. We stood there facing each other for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only seconds. The creature tilted its head from side to side, as if studying me, trying to understand what I was. I could hear it breathing, wet, rattling sound that made my skin crawl, and with each breath, that horrible sweet decay smell grew stronger, radiating from this thing like heat from a furnace. Then it spoke, not with its mouth, not in any language I recognized, but somehow I understood what it was trying to communicate. The words formed in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely, and they carried with them a sense of age, of intelligence, of power that was completely alien to anything human. It was telling me to leave, to never return to this place, to forget everything I had seen. But there was more, much more. The voice in my head was ancient, older than human civilization, older than the mountains themselves. It spoke of territory, of boundaries that had been violated, of consequences for those who trespassed in sacred places. It told me that I had been permitted to leave once, but that there would be no second chances, no mercy for those who ignored the warnings. But the most terrifying part of the communication wasn't the words themselves. It was the images that came with them. Visions of other humans who had wandered into this territory over the years, hikers, campers, researchers, all of whom had disappeared without a trace. I saw flashes of terror, of pursuit, of capture, of things being done to these people that I can't even bring myself to describe. I realized that this creature, this intelligence, wasn't alone. There were others, many others, living in the deepest parts of the wilderness, in places where humans rarely ventured. They had been here long before we arrived, and they would be here long after we were gone. They tolerated our presence in the more accessible areas, but the deep wilderness, the remote valleys and hidden places, those belonged to them. The creature took a step closer, and I could see details that made my sanity begin to fray at the edges. Its skin wasn't quite skin. It was something else, something that seemed to shift and change texture as I watched. And there were symbols carved into its flesh, the same symbols I had seen at my campsite, glowing faintly with a phosphorescent light. I don't remember making the conscious decision to run, but suddenly I was crashing through the forest at a full sprint, my heavy pack bouncing against my back, branches tearing at my clothes, rocks threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me I could hear that creature moving through the trees, not chasing me exactly, but following, making sure I was actually leaving its territory. The sounds it made as it moved were unlike anything in nature, a combination of footsteps, scraping, and something that sounded almost like laughter. The next few hours were a blur of exhaustion and terror. I ran when I could, hiked as fast as possible when the terrain was too rough for running, and never once looked back. My GPS showed that I was making good time toward the trailhead, but I felt like I was moving through some kind of nightmare, where distance and time had no real meaning. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, and no matter how far I traveled, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded, guided along a specific route by unseen watchers. Several times during my desperate flight, I heard those calls again, the same mournful, alien sounds from the night before, but now they seemed to be coming from all around me, coordinating, communicating, reporting on my progress. I was being tracked, monitored by creatures that moved through the wilderness with an ease and silence that was terrifying to contemplate. When I finally reached my vehicle around 2 in the afternoon, I was completely exhausted, dehydrated, and probably in mild shock. I threw my gear into the back of the truck without any organization, started the engine, and drove away from that place as fast as the rough dirt roads would allow. But even as I put distance between myself and that cursed valley, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that eyes were following my progress from hidden vantage points throughout the forest. It wasn't until I reached the main highway that I finally felt like I could breathe normally again. But the relief was temporary, because I knew that what I had experienced would change everything. My understanding of the world, my place in it, my career, my entire life. Nothing would ever be the same. The drive back to the ranger station took nearly 3 hours, and during that entire time I debated what I should tell my supervisor. The rational part of my brain kept insisting that I had experienced some kind of stress-induced hallucination, that the isolation and unusual circumstances had caused me to imagine things that weren't real. But the evidence was undeniable. The photographs of the stripped trees, the strange footprints, the symbols, the documented GPS locations of all these anomalies. When I finally arrived at the ranger station, I found my supervisor, Jim Morrison, working late in his office. Jim had been with the Park Service for over 25 years, and if anyone would know how to handle this situation, it would be him. I knocked on his door and asked if I could speak with him privately about my patrol report. My voice was shaking, my hands were trembling, and I'm sure I looked like hell. Jim took one look at me and immediately knew something serious had happened. He closed his office door, poured 2 cups of coffee, and told me to start from the beginning. I spent the next hour detailing everything I had experienced, showing him the photographs I had taken, and describing the encounter with that creature in as much detail as I could manage. Several times during my account, I had to stop and collect myself. The memories were so vivid, so terrifying, that reliving them was almost as bad as experiencing them the first time. To his credit, Jim listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. When I finished, he sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the photographs spread across his desk. I could see him studying the images, the footprints, the symbols, the stripped trees, his expression growing more and more troubled with each passing moment. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of concern and resignation, and something else, something that looked almost like fear. That's when Jim told me something that changed my entire understanding of my job and of the wilderness areas I had been patrolling for 15 years. He explained that what I had encountered was not unprecedented, that there had been similar reports from other rangers over the years, always from the same remote areas, always involving the same types of phenomena. The stories were remarkably consistent, creatures that defied classification, underground sounds and vibrations, trees stripped in deliberate patterns, symbols carved into earth and stone, and always that same overwhelming sense of being watched, being evaluated, being warned. According to Jim, the Park Service had been quietly documenting these incidents for decades, but had made the institutional decision to classify them as confidential. The official position was that these reports represented misidentifications of known wildlife, combined with the psychological stress of working alone in remote wilderness areas. But Jim, speaking off the record, admitted that he believed there was something genuinely unexplained happening in certain sections of the park. He showed me a thick file folder that contained dozens of similar reports, dating back to the 1970s. Rangers describing encounters with creatures that didn't match any known species, strange sounds and vibrations coming from underground areas of forest that appeared to have been deliberately altered or marked, and always that same sickening sweet smell that seemed to accompany these phenomena. The reports were chilling in their consistency. Different rangers, different years, different seasons, but the same basic elements appearing again and again. Creatures of impossible size and intelligence, symbols that suggested some kind of written language, evidence of underground activity in areas where geological surveys showed nothing unusual, and most disturbing of all, the disappearances. Jim explained that over the years, several hikers and campers had gone missing in these remote areas. Their disappearances were officially attributed to accidents, animal attacks, or simple cases of people getting lost in the wilderness. But the pattern was troubling. Experienced outdoors people vanishing without a trace, search efforts finding no evidence of their fate, and in some cases, the discovery of personal belongings arranged in ways that suggested they had been deliberately placed rather than lost. He told me about Sarah Martinez, a fellow ranger who had worked in northern sectors for over a decade. She had filed a report similar to mine in the early 2000s, describing an encounter with what she called tall ones, creatures that moved through the forest with impossible silence and seemed to communicate through some form of telepathy. After filing her report, Sarah had requested a transfer to a different park, citing personal reasons. But Jim suspected that, like me, she had been traumatized by her encounter with something that shouldn't exist. Jim showed me other files, meteorological reports from the affected areas showing temperature anomalies that couldn't be explained, seismic data indicating underground activity that didn't match any known geological processes, even satellite imagery that showed patterns in the forest canopy that suggested large-scale manipulation of the vegetation. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was also carefully compartmentalized, buried in bureaucratic files where it would never attract outside attention. The Park Service's policy, Jim explained, was based on a combination of genuine skepticism and bureaucratic self-preservation. Officials genuinely believed that most of these reports could be explained by conventional means, misidentification, psychological stress, equipment malfunction. But they were also concerned about the potential for public panic if stories of unknown creatures living in national parks became widespread. The tourism industry would suffer, funding would be threatened, and the Park Service would face scrutiny from Congress and other oversight bodies. So the official response was to quietly reassign personnel who filed these reports, discourage them from discussing their experiences, and avoid sending other rangers into the areas where incidents were most likely to occur. It wasn't a cover-up exactly, but it was a deliberate effort to minimize the impact of phenomena that couldn't be easily explained or controlled. Jim told me that I had several options. I could file an official report knowing that it would be quietly dismissed, buried in paperwork, and I would likely be transferred to a desk job or a less sensitive assignment. I could keep quiet about what I had experienced, continue my regular duties, and hope that I would never encounter these creatures again. Or I could request a transfer to a different park system, starting fresh somewhere far from the remote wilderness areas of the Pacific Northwest. None of these options felt satisfactory, but I was exhausted, traumatized, and honestly, I wasn't sure I trusted my own perceptions anymore. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that there had to be some logical explanation for what I had experienced, but the evidence was undeniable. The photographs, the GPS coordinates, the physical sensations I had felt, all of it pointed to something beyond conventional understanding. Jim suggested that I take a few days of personal leave, get some rest, and then decide how I wanted to proceed. He also recommended that I speak with Dr. Patricia Chun, a psychologist who worked with Park Service personnel, someone who had experience dealing with rangers who had undergone traumatic experiences in the wilderness. He assured me that anything I discussed with Dr. Chun would remain confidential, and that seeking help wouldn't affect my employment status. I agreed to take the personal leave and scheduled an appointment with Dr. Chun for the following week. But as I drove home that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every movement in my peripheral vision made my heart race. The encounter had left me hypervigilant, constantly scanning my environment for signs of danger, even the safety of suburban neighborhoods. That night, for the first time in years, I slept with all the lights on in my house and a baseball bat within easy reach. Every sound outside made me jump. Every creak of the house settling made me think that something was trying to get in. I found myself getting up repeatedly to check the locks on all the doors and windows, unable to shake the feeling that I was still being watched, still being hunted. The next few days passed in a haze of insomnia and anxiety. I couldn't concentrate on simple tasks, couldn't watch television or read without my mind wandering back to that valley, to those footprints circling my campsite, to that creature standing in the tree line with its impossible black eyes. I found myself researching everything I could find about unexplained phenomena in wilderness areas, reading accounts of Bigfoot sightings, alien encounters, cryptid reports, searching for something, anything, that might help me understand what I had experienced. What I found was both reassuring and disturbing. There were hundreds, maybe thousands, of similar reports from wilderness areas around the world. People describing encounters with creatures that defied classification, areas where electronic equipment malfunctioned, places where the normal rules of nature seemed suspended. The details varied, but the core elements remained consistent: intelligence, territoriality, and a clear message that humans were not welcome in certain places. But what struck me most was how these reports were treated, dismissed by mainstream science, relegated to fringe websites and tabloid publications, the witnesses portrayed as delusional or attention-seeking. It was clear that anyone who came forward with experiences like mine would face ridicule and skepticism from the scientific community, which explained why the Park Service was so reluctant to acknowledge these phenomena officially. My appointment with Dr. Chun was scheduled for Thursday morning, and I spent the days leading up to it trying to organize my thoughts, to find a way to explain what had happened without sounding completely insane. Dr. Chun had an office in downtown Portland, about an hour's drive from my home, and as the appointment approached, I found myself both dreading and looking forward to the opportunity to speak with someone who might understand. Dr. Chun turned out to be a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her office was decorated with photographs of various national parks, and she had an immediate warmth that put me somewhat at ease. She began by explaining that she had worked with park personnel for over 15 years, and that she was familiar with the unique psychological stresses that came with working in remote wilderness areas. I started by giving her the basic facts: a patrol route, the unusual silence in the forest, the stripped trees, the strange sounds and vibrations. As I spoke, I watched her face carefully, looking for signs of skepticism or disbelief, but she simply listened, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting more details about specific aspects of my experience. When I got to the part about the creature, the direct encounter, I expected her to start taking notes about possible hallucinations or stress-induced psychosis, but instead, she leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more intense, and asked me to describe the creature in as much detail as I could remember. She was particularly interested in the telepathic communication, the symbols I had seen, and the sense of ancient intelligence that had accompanied the encounter. After I finished my account, Dr. Chun sat in silence for several minutes, clearly processing what I had told her. Finally, she spoke, and what she said shocked me more than anything I had experienced in that valley. She told me that I was not the first park ranger she had counseled who had reported similar experiences, and that over the years, she had developed her own theories about what might be happening in certain wilderness areas. According to Dr. Chun, there were locations throughout the world where the normal laws of physics seemed to operate differently, places where consciousness, reality, and the natural world intersected in ways that mainstream science didn't yet understand. She had studied reports of these phenomena for decades, and had concluded that there were indeed entities, intelligences, that existed in remote wilderness areas, beings that had evolved along completely different lines than terrestrial life. She explained that these entities seemed to exist partially in our physical dimension and partially in what she called adjacent realities, which would explain their ability to appear and disappear seemingly at will, their apparent telepathic abilities, and their capacity to manipulate the physical environment in ways that defied conventional understanding. The underground vibrations, the temperature anomalies, the electromagnetic disturbances, all of these could be byproducts of their presence in our reality. Dr. Chun had theorized that these entities had established territories in the most remote wilderness areas, places where human presence was minimal and sporadic. They tolerated occasional intrusions by hikers and researchers, but became aggressive when they perceived threats to their domain or their privacy. The missing persons cases, the mysterious disappearances, these might represent instances where the entities decided that particular humans posed too great a risk to their secrecy. What made her theories particularly compelling was the consistency of reports from around the world. Similar entities described in the Amazon rainforest, the Siberian wilderness, remote areas of Alaska and Canada, the Australian outback, always in the most inaccessible regions, always demonstrating the same basic characteristics: intelligence, territoriality, and abilities that transcended normal biological limitations. Dr. Chin showed me a collection of files, reports from other park personnel, researchers, military personnel, pilots, all describing encounters with entities that matched what I had experienced. The details varied, but the core elements remained constant: tall humanoid figures, telepathic communication, symbols that suggested written language, areas of forest that showed signs of deliberate manipulation, and always that same sense of ancient intelligence observing human activities. She explained that she had been quietly documenting these cases for years, building a database of encounters, looking for patterns that might help explain the nature of these entities and their relationship with human civilization. Her work was unofficial, conducted in her spare time, because she knew that presenting these theories through official channels would end her career and destroy her credibility in the scientific community. But Dr. Chun believed that humanity was on the verge of a paradigm shift, a moment when our understanding of reality would expand to encompass phenomena that were currently dismissed as impossible. She saw people like me, witnesses to these encounters, as pioneers, individuals who were being exposed to aspects of reality that would eventually be acknowledged by mainstream science. The session with Dr. Chun lasted nearly 3 hours, and by the end, I felt simultaneously relieved and more troubled than before. Relieved because I now knew that I wasn't losing my mind, that other people had experienced similar phenomena and maintained their sanity, but troubled because the implications of what she was suggesting were staggering. If these entities were real, if they possessed the abilities that witnesses described, then humanity's understanding of the natural world was fundamentally flawed. Dr. Chun recommended that I continue our sessions, exploring the psychological impact of my encounter while also documenting additional details that might emerge as I processed the experience. She also suggested that I consider joining a support group, a small network of individuals who had undergone similar experiences, people who could provide understanding and perspective that mainstream society couldn't offer. I left her office feeling like I was standing at a crossroads. I could try to return to my normal life, pretend that nothing had happened, continue my work as a park ranger while avoiding the remote areas where I might encounter these entities again. Or I could embrace the reality of what I had experienced, join Dr. Chen's informal research network, and help document phenomena that might eventually change humanity's understanding of the world. The decision became easier the following week, when Jim Morrison called me into his office for another private conversation. He had been in contact with park supervisors from other regions, sharing details of my encounter, and had learned that similar incidents were being reported with increasing frequency. Rangers from Yellowstone, Glacier National Park, the Olympic Peninsula, all describing encounters with entities that matched my experience. More disturbing, there had been another disappearance. An experienced hiker named Michael Chun, no relation to Dr. Chun, had vanished while backpacking alone in a remote area of North Cascades National Park. His camp had been found intact, his gear undisturbed, but Michael himself was nowhere to be found. Search and rescue teams had spent weeks scouring the area, using helicopters, search dogs, thermal imaging equipment, but had found no trace of him. What made Michael's disappearance particularly unsettling was the location where his camp had been discovered. It was less than 5 miles from the valley where I had encountered the tall creature, in an area that showed many of the same anomalies I had documented: stripped trees, unusual symbols carved into the earth, that same sickening sweet smell that seemed to permeate areas where these entities were active. Jim told me that the Park Service was quietly implementing new policies, restricting access to certain remote areas, requiring rangers to patrol in pairs rather than alone, installing additional communication equipment in areas where cell phone coverage was poor. The official justification was improved safety protocols, but Jim and I both knew that these measures were really about protecting personnel from encounters with entities that the government couldn't officially acknowledge. I realized that my encounter hadn't been an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern, a phenomenon that was becoming more frequent, more visible, harder to dismiss or cover up. The entities that had remained hidden in the deepest wilderness for centuries, maybe millennia, were either becoming more active or human encroachment into their territories was increasing to the point where conflicts were inevitable. That night, I made my decision. I called Dr. Chun and told her that I wanted to join her research network to help document these encounters and search for answers. I also called Jim and requested a transfer to a different position within the Park Service, something that would keep me away from the remote wilderness areas where these entities were most active, at least until I better understood what we were dealing with. The transfer was approved within a week, and I found myself assigned to visitor services at Mount Hood National Forest, a much more developed area where the likelihood of encountering these entities was minimal. The work was less challenging than wilderness patrol, but it allowed me to maintain my career while pursuing the research that had become my obsession. Over the following months, I attended regular sessions with Dr. Chun, both individual therapy to help me process my traumatic experience, and group meetings with other witnesses. I met Sarah Martinez, the ranger Jim had mentioned, along with several other park personnel who had encountered similar entities. Their stories were remarkably consistent, and hearing them helped me understand that what I had experienced was part of a much larger phenomenon. We also began conducting our own informal research, visiting locations where encounters had been reported, documenting physical evidence, interviewing witnesses, building a comprehensive database of information about these entities and their behavior. The work was dangerous. We never ventured into the deep wilderness alone, and we always carried emergency communication equipment. But we felt compelled to search for answers. What we discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. The entities seemed to exist in a complex social structure, with different types serving different functions. Some were scouts, like the creature I had encountered, tall, mobile, capable of telepathic communication. Others appeared to be workers, responsible for the tree stripping and symbol carving that marked their territories. Still others seemed to be guardians, massive, powerful beings that protected the deeper wilderness areas where their primary communities were located. We found evidence of underground complexes, vast networks of tunnels and chambers that extended deep beneath the forest floor. The acoustic anomalies, the ground vibrations, the temperature fluctuations, all of these seemed to be connected to activity in these subterranean structures. It was as if an entire civilization existed beneath our feet, hidden from human detection by technology and abilities that we couldn't comprehend. The symbols we discovered in various locations began to show patterns, recurring elements that suggested a written language of considerable sophistication. Dr. Chun worked with linguists, anthropologists, and cryptographers to try to decipher the meanings, but progress was slow. The symbols seemed to operate on multiple levels, conveying not just information, but emotional and conceptual content that didn't translate easily into human languages. Perhaps most disturbing was the evidence, suggesting that these entities had been observing human civilization for centuries, maybe longer. We found symbols that seemed to reference historical events, wars, natural disasters, technological developments, as if they had been keeping detailed records of human progress, studying us the way we might study laboratory animals. The implications were staggering. If these entities possessed advanced technology, sophisticated social structures, and centuries of accumulated knowledge about human civilization, then they represented either an enormous opportunity for expanding human understanding, or a threat beyond anything our species had ever faced. The fact that they remained hidden, that they actively avoided contact with mainstream human society, suggested that they had made a deliberate choice to remain separate, to observe rather than interact. But that choice was becoming harder to maintain. Human expansion into wilderness areas, climate change, technological advances that made remote locations more accessible. All of these factors were bringing our two species into increasing contact. The encounters that had once been rare anomalies were becoming more frequent, more visible, harder to dismiss or cover up. Our research group began documenting cases where military personnel had encountered these entities, pilots reporting unusual aerial phenomena over remote wilderness areas, radar operators detecting objects that moved in ways that defied known physics, special forces teams conducting training exercises in remote locations, describing encounters with entities that demonstrated abilities far beyond normal biological limitations. We also found connections between these encounters and various government programs. Project Blue Book, remote viewing experiments, underground facility construction projects in wilderness areas. It seemed that certain elements within the government were aware of these entities and had been attempting to study or contact them for decades, but always in secret, always with the understanding that public knowledge would cause panic and social upheaval. The more we learned, the more questions arose. Were these entities native to Earth, an ancient species that had evolved in parallel with humanity? Or were they visitors from somewhere else, using advanced technology to establish hidden bases in our most remote locations? Were they benevolent observers, neutral researchers studying human development, or did they have their own agenda that might conflict with human interests? We found evidence supporting multiple theories. Some encounters suggested that the entities were genuinely alien, possessing technology and abilities that seemed to violate known physical laws. Other evidence pointed to an ancient terrestrial species, one that had achieved advanced civilization while humanity was still in its primitive stages. The truth might involve elements of both, or something completely different that our current understanding couldn't encompass. What became clear was that these entities were not going to remain hidden much longer. The frequency of encounters was increasing. The evidence was becoming harder to dismiss, and somewhere in government or military circles, people with significant resources were taking these phenomena seriously. Whether that would lead to official disclosure or deeper secrecy remained to be seen. As our research continued, I found myself changing. The encounter in that valley had awakened something in me, awareness of realities beyond normal human perception. I began to notice things that others missed, subtle signs that these entities might be present, electromagnetic disturbances, temperature fluctuations, the same oppressive silence that had preceded my original encounter. Dr. Chun explained that this heightened sensitivity was common among people who had direct contact with these entities, as if the encounter had somehow attuned me to their presence, open channels of perception that normally remained closed. It was both a gift and a curse, allowing me to detect phenomena that others couldn't perceive, but also making me hypersensitive to environmental anomalies that might or might not be significant. I also began experiencing dreams, or what felt like dreams, in which I found myself back in that valley, standing face to face with the tall creature, receiving information that I couldn't quite remember upon waking. Dr. Chun suggested that these might not be dreams at all, but some form of telepathic contact, the entities attempting to communicate with me across distance and time. The content of these experiences was frustrating. I would wake with the distinct impression that I had received important information, crucial understanding about the nature of these entities and their relationship with humanity. But the details would slip away like water through my fingers, leaving only vague impressions and emotional residues. During one particularly vivid experience, I found myself standing in what appeared to be an underground chamber, vast beyond imagination, filled with symbols that covered every surface. The same creature I had encountered in the forest was there, along with others, dozens of them, all focused on complex displays of information that seemed to shimmer and shift as I watched. I had the distinct impression that they were monitoring something, tracking events or conditions that were of crucial importance to their survival and to humanity's future. When I tried to approach the displays, to understand what they were monitoring, the creatures turned their attention to me, and I felt that same overwhelming presence in my mind, ancient, patient, but also urgent. They were trying to communicate something vital, something that humanity needed to understand. but the information was too complex, too alien for my human consciousness to fully grasp. I woke from this experience with a sense of profound urgency, a conviction that these entities were not just observers, but active participants in events that would soon affect all of human civilization. Whether they were trying to help us, warn us, or prepare us for something, I couldn't determine, but their interest in humanity was definitely not casual. Dr. Chen documented these experiences, along with similar reports from other members of our research group. We were all experiencing some form of ongoing contact, receiving information that we couldn't fully understand or remember, but which left us with the distinct impression that we were being prepared for something, chosen to serve as bridges between our two species. When the time for open contact finally arrived, the research group grew slowly, adding new members who had undergone their own encounters. Rangers, hikers, researchers, military personnel, even a few scientists from government agencies who had been quietly investigating these phenomena for years. We developed protocols for documenting encounters, collecting physical evidence, and supporting individuals who were struggling to process their experiences. One of our most significant discoveries came when we began mapping the locations of reported encounters. When plotted on topographical maps, the sightings showed clear patterns, clusters around areas with specific geographical features, underground water systems, unusual mineral deposits, places where the Earth's magnetic field showed anomalous readings. It was as if these entities were drawn to locations with particular energetic or geological properties. We also found correlations with historical data. Areas where encounters were most frequent often corresponded with locations that had been considered sacred by indigenous peoples, places where Native American tribes had reported contact with supernatural beings, or where ancient legends spoke of spirits that dwelt beneath the earth. It seemed that these entities had been interacting with human civilizations for thousands of years, but always in ways that allowed them to remain hidden from mainstream society. This historical perspective added another layer to our understanding. These entities weren't recent arrivals. They had been sharing the planet with humanity since the dawn of recorded history, possibly much longer. Their current behavior, the increasing frequency of encounters, might represent a shift in their long-term strategy rather than a new phenomenon. Perhaps most significantly, we began to identify what appeared to be communication attempts, instances where these entities seemed to be trying to establish more formal contact with human civilization. The symbols we found in encounter sites were becoming more complex, more detailed, as if they were evolving into a more sophisticated form of written communication. Some of the messages appeared to contain mathematical concepts, astronomical data, information that suggested these entities possessed advanced scientific knowledge. One set of symbols, discovered at multiple sites across the Pacific Northwest, seemed to depict a timeline, events stretching from the distant past into the near future. We couldn't decipher most of the content, but certain elements were recognizable, representations that corresponded to major historical events, wars, natural disasters, technological developments, and, at the end of the timeline, symbols that seemed to indicate some kind of convergence. A point where the hidden world of these entities would intersect with human civilization in ways that could no longer be concealed. The implications were staggering. If these symbols represented accurate information, then these entities possessed not only advanced technology and scientific knowledge, but some form of precognitive ability, the capacity to perceive future events and plan accordingly. The timeline suggested that the period of hidden observation was coming to an end, that within the next few years, maybe sooner, contact between our species would become unavoidable. As this understanding emerged, our research group faced a difficult decision. Should we continue our quiet investigation, documenting evidence and preparing for eventual contact, or should we attempt to publicize our findings, to warn humanity about what might be coming? The risks were enormous either way. If we went public, we would face ridicule and professional destruction. But if we remained silent, humanity might be unprepared for contact with entities that possessed abilities far beyond our current understanding. Dr. Chen argued for continued discretion, pointing out that premature disclosure might cause panic and interfere with whatever process these entities were following. If they had been planning contact for years or decades, rushing forward with incomplete information might disrupt their preparations and lead to conflict rather than cooperation. Others in the group, particularly the military personnel, believed that government and defense agencies needed to be informed immediately, that these entities might represent a security threat that required immediate assessment and response. They argued that the right of individuals and small groups to make decisions about contact was superseded by national security concerns. I found myself torn between these positions. My encounter had been traumatic, but not overtly hostile. The entities had allowed me to leave their territory, had communicated warnings rather than direct threats. This suggested that they were not immediately dangerous to human civilization, but their vast technological superiority meant that they could become threats if they chose to. The debate within our group intensified when we received reports of new developments. Military radar stations along the Pacific coast had begun detecting unusual aerial activity over wilderness areas, objects that moved too fast and maneuvered too precisely to be conventional aircraft, but which displayed none of the heat signatures associated with known propulsion systems. At the same time, seismic monitoring stations were registering subsurface activity in areas where encounters had been reported, not earthquakes exactly, but patterns of ground movement that suggested large-scale construction or excavation projects. Something was happening beneath the wilderness areas, activity that was accelerating and becoming more visible to human detection systems. Perhaps most ominously, the disappearances were increasing. Not just individual hikers or campers, but groups of people, experienced wilderness professionals who should have been capable of handling any normal emergency. Search and rescue efforts were finding camps that appeared to have been abandoned mid-activity, meals half prepared, equipment scattered as if people had been interrupted, and then simply vanished. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Something was actively removing humans from wilderness areas, either because they were perceived as threats or because they were needed for some purpose we couldn't understand. The entities that had once seemed content to observe from a distance were becoming more aggressive, more willing to interfere directly with human activities. This escalation forced our research group to accelerate our own timeline. We began compiling all of our evidence into comprehensive reports, preparing documentation that could be presented to government agencies if the situation continued to deteriorate. We also established emergency communication protocols, ways to quickly share information if any of us encountered immediate threats. The pressure was enormous. We were a small group of individuals trying to understand and prepare for contact with entities that possessed technology and abilities far beyond human comprehension. We had no official backing, no government resources, no access to advanced research facilities, just our own observations and the growing certainty that humanity was about to face the most significant challenge in its history. As winter approached, the frequency of encounters seemed to be increasing exponentially. Reports were coming in from wilderness areas across North America, similar entities, similar phenomena, similar evidence of underground activity and technological superiority. What had begun as isolated incidents in remote locations was becoming a continent-wide pattern that could no longer be dismissed or covered up. Dr. Chen called an emergency meeting of our research group. Representatives from similar groups in other regions, researchers who had been quietly documenting these phenomena for years, military personnel who had encountered these entities during training exercises, scientists from government agencies who had been studying related phenomena under classified programs. The meeting took place at a remote conference center in the Oregon mountains, chosen specifically because it was far from population centers, but still accessible to our scattered membership. What I learned during those 3 days changed my understanding not just of these entities, but of humanity's place in a much larger and more complex universe. The full scope of the phenomenon was staggering. Encounters had been documented on every continent, in wilderness areas around the world, always following the same basic patterns, but with variations that suggested different types or subspecies of entities. Some were tall and thin like the creature I had encountered. Others were shorter, but more heavily built. Still others seemed to exist primarily as energy patterns that could manipulate physical matter without having fixed forms. What united all these reports was evidence of advanced technology, sophisticated social organization, and capabilities that transcended normal biological limitations. These entities could manipulate electromagnetic fields, alter local temperature and atmospheric conditions, move through solid matter, communicate telepathically across vast distances, and apparently travel between dimensions or realities in ways that human science couldn't explain. But perhaps most significantly, the timeline of encounters showed clear acceleration. What had been rare isolated incidents in the early 20th century had become increasingly frequent, and the pattern was approaching something that could only be described as exponential growth. If the trend continued, encounters would become so common that concealment would be impossible within a matter of years, possibly months. The consensus among the assembled researchers was that these entities were preparing for something, whether it was formal contact with human civilization, evacuation from Earth to avoid some impending catastrophe, or implementation of some agenda that required greater interaction with humanity, remained unclear. But the evidence strongly suggested that the period of hidden observation was ending, and that both species were entering a new phase of relationship. The meeting concluded with the formation of a coordinated research network, sharing information, resources, and support across regional boundaries. We also established protocols for rapid communication in case of major developments, and began preparing comprehensive documentation that could be presented to government officials when the situation reached the point where official acknowledgement became unavoidable. I returned home from that meeting with a profound sense that my life had been permanently altered, not just by my original encounter in the wilderness, but by the understanding that I was now part of something much larger, a small group of humans who had been chosen, or who had chosen themselves, to serve as bridges between two species during the most important transition in human history. The work was dangerous, mentally and emotionally exhausting, and carried enormous personal risks, but it was also the most meaningful thing I had ever done. If these entities were preparing for contact, then humanity needed people who understood their capabilities, their intentions, and their perspective on the relationship between our species. Over the following months, as winter turned to spring, the pattern of encounters continued to accelerate. But now we were ready, documenting everything, analyzing patterns, preparing for whatever was coming. We couldn't stop the process, couldn't slow down the timeline that these entities seemed to be following, but we could ensure that humanity wasn't caught completely off guard when the moment of open contact finally arrived. The question that haunted all of us was whether that moment would bring opportunity or catastrophe. These entities possessed the power to either elevate human civilization to unimaginable heights or to end it entirely. Everything depended on their intentions, their assessment of humanity's readiness for contact, and their own needs and agenda. As I write this now, almost a year after my encounter in that remote valley, I can feel the tension building. Like the atmosphere before a massive thunderstorm, something is coming, something that will change everything. And those of us who have encountered these entities may be the only ones who can help our species navigate the challenges ahead. The work continues, the documentation grows, and we wait, watching for signs that the moment of contact is finally at hand. When that moment comes, I hope we're ready. I hope humanity is ready, because ready or not, I believe our isolation in the universe is about to end forever. Thank you so much for watching this video. I know this story was long and probably difficult to believe, but I felt it was important to share every detail I could remember. These experiences have changed my life completely, and I believe they're part of something much larger that humanity needs to understand. What do you think about these encounters? Have you ever experienced anything similar in wilderness areas or remote locations? Do you believe we're alone in the universe, or do you think there might be other intelligences sharing our planet? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Please let me know what topics you'd like me to cover in future videos. Should I share more encounters from other park rangers? Would you like to hear about the research we're conducting? Or are there other unexplained phenomena you'd like me to investigate? Your feedback helps me decide what content to create next. If you found the story compelling, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss new content. Share this video with friends who might be interested in unexplained phenomena, and give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed the experience. Your support helps me continue documenting these important stories and sharing them with the world. Until next time, stay safe out there in the wilderness, and remember, we may not be as alone as we think we are.